Good evening. Tonight's story is called A Quiet Tour of the Interstellar Starship Genesis. Let your body settle into the mattress beneath you. Let your shoulders become heavy. Let your hands rest wherever they are most comfortable. There's nowhere you need to be. There's nothing you need to accomplish. And when you're ready, close your eyes. Somewhere far above the surface of the Earth, Genesis would be moving quietly through the darkness. You would not hear its engines from here. You would not see its lights. You would only know that it was there because somewhere beyond the atmosphere, a small collection of lights was drifting quietly through the night, carrying its passengers farther from the world they had once called home. Inside the ship, though, it would feel surprisingly ordinary. The lights would be low, the air would be warm, carrying the faint, clean smell of recycled air. It would be a neutral smell, almost impossible to notice after a while. Somewhere farther down the corridor, you might catch the softer scent of coffee coming from the galley. The ventilation would be running quietly above you. You would hear the steady movement of air through the vents, the pumps circulating the water, the faint vibration of machinery operating somewhere deeper inside Genesis. None of it would be loud. After several weeks aboard the ship, you might hardly notice it at all. It would become like the sound of a refrigerator in a house on Earth, something you only noticed when it stopped. Your sleeping compartment would be small. There would be a narrow bed, a storage cabinet, a reading light, and a few personal things attached securely to the walls. Everything would have its place. On Earth, you could leave a book on a table and walk away. Here, the book would eventually find its way across the room. So most objects aboard Genesis would be secured with simple catches, magnetic surfaces, or small restraints. Nothing complicated, just enough to keep ordinary life from becoming inconvenient. If you look toward the small display beside your bed, you would see the time. The ship would not need an alarm clock to make the morning feel different. There would be no sunlight creeping through curtains. There would be no traffic outside, no birds, no distant voices from a street below. Instead, the lighting system would slowly increase in brightness, a gentle imitation of morning. Warm light first, then a little brighter, then the full level used during the ship's daytime cycle. You might remain in bed for a while. There would be no reason to hurry. Genesis would continue moving whether you got up immediately or waited another 10 minutes. Outside, the stars would remain almost perfectly still. The ship would be traveling through a darkness so large that there would be very little to look at for long periods of time. But inside, there would be life. You would hear a door opening somewhere along the corridor. Then footsteps. Someone would be beginning their own morning. Perhaps a member of the engineering team. Perhaps someone from hydroponics. Perhaps someone who had simply been awake for a few minutes, longer than you. The sound would pass your door and disappear again. And you might find yourself listening to the ship in the same way you once listened to a house. The distant movement of people, the ventilation, a pipe carrying warm water through the walls, a soft mechanical click from somewhere nearby. Small sounds, ordinary sounds, the kind of sounds that would make a place feel occupied. Eventually you would sit up. The mattress beneath you would feel familiar. Your feet would touch the floor, and for a moment, you might forget where you were. Then you would remember. Genesis. The The first thing you might do would be to open the door. The corridor outside would be softly illuminated. It would not look like the command center of a spacecraft. There would be no flashing warning lights, no large screens demanding your attention, just a narrow passage through the habitation section with handrails along the walls and recessed lighting above. The surfaces would be practical, easy to clean, designed to survive years of use. There might be a few photographs attached to one wall, a landscape from Earth, a family, a mountain, a coastline, small reminders of a planet that was becoming increasingly distant. If you stopped there for a moment, you might look at one of the photographs. Then you would continue walking, because this was not a museum, it was your home, and there would be breakfast waiting somewhere ahead. As you moved farther down the corridor, the quiet sounds of the ship would begin to mix with the sounds of morning. A cupboard opening, water running, someone speaking softly, the faint clink of a spoon against a cup, and underneath it all, the steady hum of Genesis. You would follow the corridor toward the center of the ship. As you step farther into the rotating section of Genesis, the change in gravity would become easier to notice. Your body would settle more naturally with each step. The slight sensation of floating would disappear. Your shoes would meet the floor with a familiar weight, and for a moment, the simplest things would feel almost comforting. Walking, turning, standing still. On a spacecraft traveling between the stars, these ordinary movements would be made possible by something very large and very simple. The ring would be rotating, slowly and continuously. There would be no sensation of spinning, no dizziness, no rushing movement outside the windows. The rotation would be gentle enough that, after living aboard Genesis for a while, you would stop thinking about it. You might walk down the curved corridor and never give a thought to the machinery turning quietly beyond the walls. The habitation ring would be one of the busiest parts of the ship. Not because anything important was happening. Quite the opposite. It would be busy because this was where people lived. Doors would open and close. Someone would carry a folded shirt from one room to another. Someone else might be returning from hydroponics with a small container of freshly harvested vegetables. A crew member might pause beside a wall panel, checking a maintenance schedule before continuing on their way. There would be no particular destination that everyone needed to reach. Just the ordinary movement of people going about their day. The corridor would be wide enough for two people to pass comfortably. Handrails would run along the walls, although you might rarely need them while the ring was rotating. The ceiling would contain recessed lights, ventilation grills, and small maintenance panels. Every few meters, there would be another doorway. Behind one might be a sleeping compartment. Behind another, a small storage room. Another might open into a shared lounge. The rooms would not be large. Space would always be valuable aboard Genesis, but they would be comfortable. A small table, a chair, a place to store personal belongings, a soft light beside the bed, enough room to close the door and have a little privacy. You might notice that the walls were not completely bare. There would be photographs, small pieces of artwork, a child's drawing, a few plants growing in containers designed for the ship, objects that had no practical purpose at all. And that would be part of what made the habitation ring feel different from the rest of Genesis. Engineering could be measured in pumps and power systems. The bridge could be measured in displays and navigation equipment, but the habitation ring would be measured in smaller things. How comfortable a chair was, how warm the lighting felt, whether there was somewhere quiet to sit, whether a person could look around and forget for a few minutes that they were thousands of millions of kilometers from Earth. You would continue walking. The corridor would curve gently with the ring. Ahead, you might hear someone laughing quietly. Then the sound would disappear behind a closed door. A few steps later, you would hear water moving through a pipe behind the wall. Then the soft hum of the ventilation system. The sounds would overlap. Water, air, footsteps, voices, the low vibration of machinery. Nothing would stand out for long. Together, they would form the ordinary sound of life aboard Genesis. You might eventually reach one of the small, common rooms. The door would open onto a quiet space with several chairs arranged around a table. There might be a few books secured to a shelf, a screen mounted against the wall, a small window looking out into space. Someone might already be sitting there, reading. They would glance up as you entered. Perhaps they would smile, then return to their book. There would be no need to speak. You could sit down for a while. Beyond the window, the stars would pass so slowly that you would barely notice their movement. Genesis would continue forward. The habitation ring would continue turning. And inside the ship, someone would be reading a book in a quiet room, just as they might have done on Earth. After a few minutes, you would stand again. There would be more of Genesis to see. The corridor would lead onward, and somewhere ahead, beneath the familiar hum of the ship, you would begin to notice another smell. Warm bread, coffee, something cooking. The galley would be nearby. The smell of warm bread and coffee would become stronger as you continued along the corridor. You would pass another doorway, then another, until the corridor opened into one of the more familiar spaces aboard Genesis. The galley. It would not be large. There would be no long rows of restaurant tables and no elaborate kitchen designed for presentation. Everything would be arranged for practicality. Counters would run along the walls. Storage compartments would fit into the spaces above and below them. A preparation area would sit beneath a series of small lights. There would be ovens, refrigerators, sinks, food processors, and equipment designed to make the most of every kilogram of food carried aboard the ship. The kitchen would be quiet in the early morning. Someone might already be preparing breakfast. You would hear a knife moving slowly across a cutting board, the soft sound of water running into a sink, a cupboard opening, then closing. The smell of coffee would linger in the warm air. There might be bread warming in one of the ovens, along with the faint smell of vegetables being cooked nearby. It would be a surprisingly familiar smell, not the smell of a spacecraft, just breakfast. You might stand near the entrance for a moment and watch. There would be nothing especially interesting happening, and that would be part of its comfort. On Earth, kitchens were rarely thought of as remarkable places. They were simply where meals were made, a place where someone might stand in the morning with a cup in one hand and a spoon in the other, waiting for water to boil. Genesis would be no different. The ingredients would be carefully measured. Fresh produce would come primarily from the hydroponic section. Other foods would be stored in sealed containers, protected from moisture and temperature changes. Nothing would be wasted. Even the water used while preparing food would eventually become part of the ship's recycling system. The systems behind an ordinary meal would be complicated, but you would not need to think about them. You would simply smell the coffee, hear the quiet sounds of cooking, and wait. The dining area would be connected to the galley by a short passage. It would be slightly larger than the kitchen, with tables arranged so the people could sit together during meals. The furniture would be simple, lightweight, securely attached. Nothing would slide across the floor when the ship changed its orientation or when someone moved quickly between tables. A few people would already be eating. One might be reading, another might be talking quietly with a friend. Someone else might simply be sitting with a cup of coffee, looking through a nearby window. You would choose a seat. The chair would be firmly fixed to the floor. For a moment, you might look around the room. The soft lighting, the quiet conversation, the smell of food, the faint hum of ventilation, the gentle vibration beneath the floor. All of these things would be reminders that, despite the darkness outside, you were surrounded by other people. Genesis could be thousands of kilometers from the nearest human being who was not aboard the ship. Yet breakfast could still feel like breakfast. You might lift your cup. The warmth would spread into your hands. Outside the window, there would be almost nothing to see. Only darkness, a few distant stars, perhaps the faint outline of a planet far away. You would take a slow sip, and for a little while, there would be no need to think about the distance ahead. No need to think about the engines. No need to think about the destination. There would only be the warm cup in your hands, the quiet conversation around you, and the ordinary smell of food. Eventually, the meal would be finished. Someone would carry a plate back toward the galley. Another person would stand and leave the room. You might remain for another minute. Then you would get up as well. Beyond the dining area, a different part of Genesis would be waiting. The corridor would become slightly narrower. The air would become warmer. And ahead, behind a series of transparent panels, you would begin to see something very different from the rest of the ship. Rows of green, plants growing beneath artificial sunlight. The hydroponic section would be just ahead. The corridor would continue beyond the dining area, and the warm smell of food would slowly give way to something different. Damp soil, green leaves, the faint, clean smell of water. You would pass through a narrow doorway and enter the hydroponic section. The temperature would be slightly warmer here. The air would feel more humid against your skin. There would be plants everywhere, not wild or overgrown. Everything would be carefully arranged in rows, with narrow walkways between them. Small lights would hang above the growing beds, providing the light that sunlight normally would. Water would move quietly through thin pipes beneath the plants. A few small pumps would run continuously. Their sound would blend with the ventilation until it became difficult to separate one from the other. You might walk slowly between the rows. Some plants would be small, while others would reach toward the lights. There would be leafy greens, herbs, vegetables, and a few plants chosen simply because the crew enjoyed having them nearby. Not everything grown here would be necessary for survival. Some things would simply make the ship feel more familiar. You might reach out and touch a leaf as you passed. It would be cool and slightly damp. A small drop of water might remain on its surface. On Earth, you might have walked through a garden without thinking much about where the water came from. Here, every drop would have already been used before. Water aboard Genesis would move through a continuous cycle. It would be collected, filtered, cleaned, used again. The same water could pass through the ship many times, traveling through pipes, storage tanks, and purification systems before returning to the plants. The process would be almost invisible. You would only notice the result: green leaves, fresh vegetables, the smell of growing things. A crew member might be working farther down the aisle. They would be checking the plants, examining the roots, and making small adjustments to the growing system. There would be no rush. Most of the work would be routine. A tray moved slightly closer to a light, a filter replaced, a pipe checked, a small task repeated every day. You might stop beside one of the growing beds. The lights above you would cast a soft glow across the leaves. Beyond them, the walls and machinery of Genesis would almost disappear. For a moment, it could be easy to forget that you were inside a spacecraft. There would be no stars here, no dark windows, no view of the empty distance outside, only green plants and the quiet sound of water moving through the system. You might breathe in slowly. The air would smell different here, cleaner, fresher. There would be the faint scent of leaves and damp growing material beneath the neutral smell of the ship. It would remind you of Earth, perhaps of a greenhouse, perhaps of a garden after rain, a place where water and sunlight had always been enough to make something grow. But here, the sunlight would come from lamps, the rain would come from pipes, and the soil would be replaced by a carefully controlled flow of water and nutrients. Everything necessary for growth would have to be provided. Nothing would simply happen by itself. And yet, once the system was running, the result would look wonderfully ordinary. Plants growing, leaves unfolding, fruit becoming heavier on its stem, green things continuing their quiet work while Genesis traveled through space. You would continue walking. The hydroponic section would extend farther than you might expect. There would be storage areas along one wall, equipment for testing water and nutrients, small workstations, containers waiting for the next harvest. The plants would be easy to reach, care for, and harvest. It would be another example of how ordinary life aboard Genesis depended on many quiet systems working together. You would eventually reach the far end of the growing area. Behind you, the soft sound of water would continue. Ahead, the corridor would lead back toward the inhabited sections of the ship. You might carry the faint smell of green leaves with you as you walked. Somewhere behind the walls, the water from the hydroponic system would continue its slow journey through Genesis. Nothing would stop. Nothing would need to. The ship would simply continue doing what it had been designed to do. Carry its people, recycle their water, grow their food, keep the air moving, and move quietly onward through the dark. You would leave the plants behind and continue toward the center of Genesis. Ahead, the corridor would begin to open again. Beneath your feet, you would gradually become aware of another gentle change. The artificial gravity would begin to feel lighter. You were leaving the rotating habitation section and moving toward the heart of the ship. As you leave the hydroponic section, the sound of running water would gradually disappear behind you. The corridor would become quieter. The gentle pull of gravity would continue to weaken until you could feel your body becoming almost weightless. You would reach the edge of the rotating habitation ring and enter a narrow passage connecting it to the non-rotating central structure of Genesis. Here, the ship would feel different. The walls would be narrower. The ceiling would be lower. There would be more exposed panels, pipes, cables, and access points. This would not be a living area. It would be part of the infrastructure that allowed the living areas to exist. You might place your hand against the wall as you moved forward. It would feel cool beneath your fingers. Behind it, air would be moving through the ventilation system. Water would be traveling through insulated pipes. Electrical power would be passing through cables hidden inside the structure. You would not see most of these systems, but you would hear them. A soft vibration, a distant pump, the occasional click of a valve, the quiet rush of air. Genesis would be full of sounds like these. Sounds that rarely demanded attention. Sounds that simply meant everything was working. As you continued, the passage would open into a larger section of the central spine. There would be maintenance platforms along the walls and small equipment compartments built into the structure. A few workstations might be occupied. A crew member could be checking a panel, reading measurements, or replacing a filter. Another might be carrying a small case of tools toward an access hatch. The work would be methodical. There would be no reason to hurry. Most maintenance aboard Genesis would be like maintaining a large building on Earth, checking what needed to be checked, replacing what needed to be replaced, cleaning what needed to be cleaned, making small adjustments before small problems could become larger ones. You might stop beside one of the open panels. Inside, you would see rows of cables and neatly arranged components. Nothing would look particularly dramatic. That would be reassuring. The systems that kept the ship alive would not need to be impressive. They only needed to be reliable. A small display would show the temperature of a nearby system. Another would show the pressure inside a pipe. Numbers would change slowly. Everything would remain within its normal range. You might watch for a few seconds before continuing. Ahead, the passage would lead farther toward the front of Genesis. The artificial gravity would now be almost completely gone. Your next step would feel lighter, then lighter still. Eventually, you would push gently against the floor and feel yourself rise a few centimeters before settling back toward the surface. It would be the natural transition from the rotating habitation ring into the weightless central structure. You would reach for the handrail and pull yourself forward. Your movement would become slower. A small push would carry you several meters. There would be no need to walk anymore. You would simply glide. The corridor would be quiet. The sound of your breathing would become easier to notice. A slow breath in, a slow breath out, and beneath it all, the faint mechanical hum of Genesis. For a moment, you might stop moving completely. You would float there in the center of the passage. Your hands would rest loosely at your sides. Your body would have almost no sense of weight. Outside the hull, there would be millions of kilometers of empty space. Inside, there would be nothing you needed to do. You could simply remain there, breathing, listening, letting the ship carry you forward. Eventually, you would reach for the rail again. A gentle pull would bring you toward the next section. Ahead, the corridor would widen. The lighting would become slightly brighter. And somewhere beyond the walls, the machinery responsible for moving Genesis through space would begin to make itself known. A deeper vibration, a steady mechanical rhythm. You would be approaching engineering, the part of the ship where the quiet systems became larger, and the journey itself became part of the machinery around you. The deeper vibration would become easier to feel as you moved farther along the central passage. It would not be loud. It would simply be there, a steady rhythm beneath the ship. The sound would travel through the walls and into the floor, reminding you that Genesis was always moving, even when everything inside seemed still. You would pass through another doorway and enter the engineering section. The space would be larger here. The ceiling would rise above you, and the narrow residential corridors would give way to open machinery spaces, maintenance platforms, pipes, conduits, and structural supports. There would be more light, not bright light, just enough to illuminate the equipment and the narrow walkways between it. You might pause near the entrance. There would be a faint smell of warm metal and clean machinery in the air. The ventilation would be stronger here. You could hear air moving through the ducts, carrying heat away from the equipment. Along one wall, thick pipes would disappear into the structure. Some would carry coolant. Others would carry water or other fluids needed by the ship. They would be insulated where necessary, with small sections of metal exposed around valves and connections. Nothing would be decorative. Every part would have a purpose. A crew member might be walking slowly along one of the maintenance platforms. They would stop beside a panel, check a few readings, and continue. The work would be quiet. Most of the time, engineering would not require anyone to do anything at all. The systems would simply run. Fans would turn, pumps would circulate fluid, power would move through cables, heat would be transferred away from equipment and carried toward the ship's thermal systems. Thousands of small processes would continue together. You would not need to understand each one. You would only need to know that they were working. At the center of the engineering space, you might see a large section of the ship's power system. It would be surrounded by protective structures and access panels. There would be warning markings and small displays, but nothing would be flashing. No alarms, no emergency lights, just steady numbers, normal temperatures, normal pressures, normal power levels. The kind of information that engineers aboard Genesis would check every day. You might watch one of the displays for a moment. The numbers would change slowly. Then you would look away. There would be nothing to worry about. That was exactly how engineering was supposed to feel. Quiet, predictable, reliable. You would continue along the platform. Below you, machinery would extend deeper into the ship. Above you, cables and pipes would disappear into the ceiling. The entire space would feel less like a room and more like the inside of a very large machine. And yet, even here, there would be small reminders of the people who maintained it. A tool placed carefully beside a workbench, a folded cloth, a cup secured inside a holder, a handwritten maintenance note attached beside an access panel. Simple things, ordinary things, signs that people had been here before you and would return again later. Eventually, the machinery around you would begin to change. The systems would become larger. The pipes would become thicker. The vibration beneath your feet would become deeper. You would be approaching the propulsion section. This would be the part of Genesis responsible for providing the gentle, continuous push that carried the ship forward. From inside, you would never experience that movement as a sensation. There would be no feeling of acceleration, no pressure against your seat, no wind rushing past the windows. Space would simply move outside, but the machinery would continue working behind the walls, quietly, patiently, for days, then weeks, then months. You might place your hand against the wall again. There would be a faint vibration beneath your palm. The ship would be moving. You would be moving with it. And somewhere behind you, the habitation ring would continue turning. The hydroponics lights would continue glowing. Water would continue circulating. People would continue eating breakfast, reading books, tending plants, and walking through the corridors. All of those ordinary things would depend on this machinery continuing its quiet work. You would remain there for another moment, listening to the deeper rhythm. Then you would turn toward the passage leading forward. The engineering section would gradually disappear behind you. Ahead, the corridor would become quieter again. The vibration would soften, and somewhere farther forward, another part of Genesis would be waiting. The bridge, the deeper vibration of engineering would gradually fade behind you as you continued toward the forward section of Genesis. The passage would become quieter. The lighting would become softer. And after a few more turns through the central structure, you would reach the access point leading toward the bridge. The bridge would be different from the rest of the ship, not because it would be grand. It would be because this was where Genesis was watched. Here, the ship's surroundings would become important. You would enter through a quiet doorway and find yourself in a wider room. Several workstations would face forward. Each would have a small display, controls, and a comfortable seat secured to the floor. There would be no enormous central screen, no flashing lights, no dramatic alarms. Most of the time, there would be very little to do. Genesis had been designed to travel for long periods without constant human control. The navigation systems could monitor the ship's position. The computers could calculate its trajectory. Sensors could watch the surrounding space. The people aboard simply needed to make sure everything remained on course. You might move toward one of the forward windows. The glass would be thick and carefully protected. Beyond it, there would be darkness, a few stars, perhaps a faint point of light belonging to a distant planet. Nothing would appear to move. That was one of the strange things about traveling through deep space. The ship could be moving incredibly fast, yet the view outside would seem almost completely still. You could stand there for several minutes and see almost no change. The stars would remain where they were. The darkness would remain dark. And Genesis would continue quietly forward. A crew member might be sitting at one of the navigation stations. They would occasionally glance at a display, check a number, make a small adjustment, then return to whatever they had been doing. The bridge would not need to feel busy. Its purpose was simply to remain aware. A small display might show the ship's current trajectory. Another would show its orientation. Others would display information from sensors positioned around the hull. Numbers would change slowly. Lines would move gradually across a screen. Nothing would demand your attention. You might sit in one of the empty seats. The chair would be comfortable and slightly reclined. The room would be quiet enough that you could hear the ventilation. You might even notice the sound of your own breathing again. A slow breath in, a slow breath out. The bridge would have a different kind of silence than the central spine. There would be fewer mechanical sounds here. The machinery would be farther away. The room would feel almost still. You could look through the forward window again. There would be nothing immediately ahead. No road, no traffic, no horizon, only the immense darkness of space. And yet, somewhere far ahead, there would be a destination. Genesis would continue toward it. You would not need to see it. You would not need to think about how far away it was. For now, it would be enough to sit quietly and watch the stars. Eventually, you might notice a faint reflection in the window, the lights of the bridge behind you, the outline of the seat, your own face, barely visible against the darkness. For a moment, the window would feel less like a screen separating you from space, and more like a quiet mirror. You were still inside, still surrounded by the ship, still part of this small collection of rooms, corridors, machines, plants, and people moving together through an enormous, empty universe. You might stand again. Before leaving, you would look toward the forward view one more time. The stars would still be there. Genesis would still be moving. And somewhere farther along the ship, another place would be waiting. A place designed for something much simpler than navigation. A place where you could sit quietly and look out at the universe. The observation area. You would leave the bridge through a quiet passage that would lead toward one of the more peaceful parts of Genesis. The sounds of the navigation systems would gradually disappear behind you. The corridor would become wider. The lighting would become softer. And ahead, the walls would begin to open toward the outside. You would enter the observation area. It would not need to be large. A few comfortable seats would be arranged near the windows, with enough space between them for people to sit without feeling crowded. The windows themselves would be thick and carefully constructed. Beyond them, there would be almost nothing, just space. You might sit beside one of the windows. The surface beneath you would feel solid and warm. The ship would be quiet around you. For a while, you might simply look outside. There would be stars in every direction. Some would be bright enough to notice immediately. Others would be so faint that you would only see them after looking for a few moments. There would be no twinkling. No atmosphere would distort their light. They would remain small and steady against the darkness. You might slowly move your eyes across the window. One star, then another, then another. There would be no horizon, no clouds, no changing sky, only the enormous darkness surrounding Genesis. And yet, the darkness would not feel empty. There would be distant suns, planets you could not see. Dust and gas spread across distances too large to understand. Everything would be there, even when your eyes could not see it. You might rest your head against the back of the seat. The window would be cool if you reached toward it. You would not be able to feel the movement of the ship. Genesis would continue traveling forward, but there would be no wind, no shaking, no sensation of speed. The ship would simply carry you through space. You might close your eyes for a moment. The ventilation would continue softly behind you. A faint vibration would pass through the seat. Somewhere farther away, a pump would start and stop. Then the room would become quiet again. When you opened your eyes, the stars would still be there. Nothing would have changed. And that might be one of the most peaceful things about deep space. There would be no need to watch constantly. No need to wait for something to happen. The universe could remain exactly as it was. You could simply sit and look. Perhaps another crew member would enter the observation area. They would walk quietly toward one of the empty seats and sit beside the window. Neither of you would need to speak. After a while, they might leave again. The door would close softly behind them, and you would remain. You might think about Earth, not with sadness, just briefly. You might remember the color of the sky in the morning, the sound of rain against a window, the smell of wet pavement, the warmth of sunlight on your face. Small things, ordinary things, things that would have seemed unimportant when you were there. Here they would feel familiar. But then you would look back toward the stars. Genesis would be your surroundings now, the corridors, the lights, the hydroponics gardens, the quiet rooms, the people moving through the ship, the soft mechanical sounds that followed you everywhere. All of it would have become familiar too. You might sit there a little longer, breathing slowly, listening to the ship, watching the stars, and eventually, when you were ready, you would stand. There would still be no reason to hurry. The observation area would remain exactly as you left it. The stars would remain outside. Genesis would continue moving. You would turn toward the corridor and begin the slow journey back through the ship. Behind you, the window would become smaller. The darkness would disappear behind the walls, and once again, you would hear the familiar sounds of Genesis around you. The ventilation, the footsteps, the quiet hum of the ship. You would be heading back toward the habitation ring. You would leave the observation area and begin the quiet journey back toward the habitation ring. There would be no need to hurry. The corridor would be familiar now. You would recognize the soft lighting above you, the handrails along the walls, the occasional maintenance panel, the small sounds of the ship moving around you. A door would open somewhere ahead. Footsteps would pass. Then everything would become quiet again. As you continued through the central passage, the faint vibration of the propulsion systems would gradually return. You would feel it beneath your feet. A gentle reminder that Genesis was still moving, still following its course, still carrying everyone aboard toward a destination that remained far ahead. You might pass one of the maintenance areas you had seen earlier. The same displays would still be showing steady numbers. The same pipes would continue carrying water and coolant. The same fans would continue moving air. Nothing would have changed, and that would be comforting. The ship did not need to constantly surprise you. Most of the time, it simply continued. You would pass another access panel, then another. The central spine would slowly give way to the familiar structure of the habitation ring. You would feel the change before you saw it. The gentle pull of artificial gravity would gradually return. Your body would begin to feel heavier. Your feet would settle more firmly against the floor. The sensation would be subtle. After living aboard Genesis for long enough, you might barely notice it. You would step forward and feel the familiar weight of your body once again. Ahead, the corridor would curve gently with the rotating ring. The lighting would be warmer here. The walls would feel less industrial. You might see a photograph you had passed earlier that morning. The same landscape from Earth. The same coastline. the same quiet reminder of where everyone had come from. You would continue walking. Someone might pass you carrying a folded piece of clothing. Another crew member might be returning from the galley. Someone else might be carrying a small tray of plants toward hydroponics. Ordinary things. The same things that could happen in an apartment building, a house, or a neighborhood on Earth. Except that outside the walls, there would be no streets, no buildings, no wind, no weather, only space. You might stop at one of the common areas again. A few people would still be there. Someone reading, someone talking quietly, someone sitting beside a window. You could join them for a few minutes. There would be no particular reason to speak. You could simply sit. The room would be warm. The lights would be soft. The ventilation would make the same quiet sound it had made everywhere else aboard Genesis. You might notice how easily you had begun to recognize those sounds. The hum of the ship, the movement of air, the vibration beneath the floor. They would no longer sound like machinery. They would sound like home. Eventually, you would stand again. The corridor would lead toward your sleeping quarters. You would pass the galley. The smell of coffee would have faded now. In its place, there might be the softer smell of warm food from the evening meal. Someone would be cleaning the counters. Water would run briefly into a sink. A cupboard would close. Then the galley would become quiet again. You would continue walking. Farther ahead, the sounds of conversation would become less frequent. The habitation ring would slowly settle into its evening rhythm. Doors would close. Lights would become softer. Footsteps would become less common. Genesis would remain awake, but the people inside it would gradually become quieter. You would pass the last common area and enter the residential corridor. Your sleeping compartment would be only a short distance away. Before entering, you might stop for a moment. You would listen. The ship would still be there. The ventilation, the pumps, the quiet vibration, the slow movement of the rotating ring, all the sounds you had heard throughout the day would continue around you. Nothing had changed. And yet, after spending the day moving through Genesis, they might sound different now. More familiar, more comforting. You would open the door to your room. Inside, the light would already be low. The bed would be waiting. And beyond the walls, Genesis would continue quietly through the darkness. You would close the door behind you. The sounds of the corridor would become softer. For a moment, you would simply stand there in the quiet of your room. The lighting would be low now, just enough to see the familiar shapes around you. The bed, the small storage cabinet, the reading light, the few personal things secured carefully to the walls. Everything would be where you left it. You might place your hand against the edge of the bed and sit down. The mattress would settle beneath you. Outside the room, Genesis would continue its slow routine. Air would move through the ventilation system. Water would circulate through the pipes. The habitation ring would continue its gentle rotation. Farther away, machinery would continue working inside the ship. You would hear none of it clearly. The sounds would blend together into one quiet background hum. You might lie back and pull the blanket over yourself. The fabric would feel warm against your skin. For a moment, you might think about everything you had seen during the day. The habitation ring, the galley, the green rows of hydroponics, the quiet machinery of engineering, the bridge, the stars beyond the observation windows. all of it would still be there. You would not need to visit any of it again tonight. The plants would continue growing. The pumps would continue running. The navigation systems would continue watching the ship's course. Genesis would continue moving forward. You could simply rest. The lighting above you would gradually become dimmer. The artificial evening would continue. There would be no sunset outside the window, no changing sky, no last light disappearing beyond a horizon. Instead, the ship would create its own night. Slowly, quietly, the room would become darker. The hum of the ventilation would remain. You might notice your breathing becoming slower. A breath in, a breath out, then another. There would be nothing else you needed to listen for. No footsteps approaching, no alarms, no voices calling you. Just the familiar sounds of the ship. The same sounds you had heard when you first woke. The same sounds that had followed you through the corridors. The same sounds that had been there in the hydroponic section, the engineering spaces, and the observation area. Genesis would be carrying everyone through the darkness. Outside, the stars would remain distant and still. Inside, the lights would continue to fade. You might close your eyes. The mattress would support your body. The blanket would rest gently across you. The ship would continue turning beneath you. The engines would continue their quiet work somewhere far away. And you would not need to know exactly how far Genesis had traveled today. You would not need to know how many kilometers remained. Those things could wait until morning. For now, there would be only the room, the bed, the quiet hum, your breathing, and the slow, steady movement of Genesis through space. You would let your thoughts become quieter. The corridors would disappear. The lights would disappear. The stars would disappear. And somewhere beyond the walls of your room, the ship would continue its journey without asking anything from you. It would carry its people through the darkness. It would keep the air warm. It would keep the water moving. It would keep the lights on. And it would continue toward the distant destination, waiting ahead. You would simply rest. There would be nowhere you needed to be. There would be nothing you needed to accomplish. Genesis would keep moving, and you could sleep. Good night, and sweet dreams. Our journey comes to an end. For now, thank you for traveling aboard the interstellar starship Genesis. If you'd like to continue exploring the stars with us, please consider subscribing for future voyages. Until we meet again, sleep well and safe travels.